Have you ever witnessed a moment so strange that everything you believed in suddenly became small? A moment where survival instinct collides with a deep awakening of the soul, where you are forced to choose between doing the safe thing and the right thing. Imagine a freezing night in the middle of a snow-covered wilderness where every footprint can be erased by a strong wind. There, three people stand before a giant wild creature, not with the eyes of a predator, but with eyes asking for help. No words, no roar, just silence and a fragile trust suspended between two worlds, man and nature. What keeps them from turning away? What compels them to embark on a journey that no map can map, where the chill comes not only from the cold, but also from the fear of the unknown? This is not a simple story. This is a story about faith, about the courage you sometimes don't know you have, until you need it most. But where did you find this story? Did a friend share it? Or did the universe arrange for it to find you? Either way, don't forget to subscribe, because tomorrow I'm going to tell you a special story, one that might make you look at life with a whole new set of eyes. Are you ready? Let's go together. In the cold, foggy night of Yukon, Canada, the wind whistled like a whisper of the wilderness. Fort Glacier, an isolated military outpost in the middle of a frozen landscape, was enveloped in the cold silence that was typical of a place where humans seemed to be but transient travelers in the eternal landscape. Sergeant Jack Donovan pulled up the collar of his uniform, his eyes scanning the gray landscape before him warily. He was a seasoned veteran who had seen the worst of the battlefield, but what he was about to face tonight was not part of any military training. Next to Jack was Luis Martinez, a young private who tried to hide his fear with jokes, and Rachel Green, a military doctor whose cool composure was sometimes more terrifying than the air outside. All three thought this would be just another boring night watch shift. But they were wrong. The shrill siren pierced the silence. The bright headlights swept over the security fence, and they saw a huge grizzly bear. Huge, ferocious, with a gray-brown coat matted with snow and mud. It was charging toward the barracks at an incredible speed. The barbed wire was torn apart as if it were a child's toy under its claws. Luis screamed, his hands shaking as he gripped his rifle. "Bear, safety off. It's charging." Jack only had time to signal him to stop. But then, something strange happened. The bear didn't charge with the instinct of a wild animal in a rage. It paused in the glare of the headlights, panting, then suddenly knelt, its front legs limp to the cold ground. It didn't roar. It didn't bar its fangs in a threatening manner. Instead, it let out a low, hoarse moan, full of exhaustion and despair, echoing through the night. Its eyes were not the eyes of a predator. They were the eyes of a cry for help. Have you ever seen a wild creature? No. A symbol of power and cruelty like the grizzly bear, so pure in its desperation that it made your heart clench? What could bring such a powerful creature to its knees before a human? Jack felt something inexplicable creep into his mind. It was more than fear. It was awakening, a feeling he had never felt before, despite facing death on the battlefield. He slowly lowered the gun, his eyes still fixed on the bear. "Wait, don't shoot," Jack whispered, his usually stern voice trembling strangely. Rachel squinted, the flashlight in her hand shining directly on the bear. What they saw stunned all three of them. Its thick, dark fur was smeared with dried blood. The signs of exhaustion and injury were obvious, but not for itself, for it showed no signs of pain. There was something else, something urgent. "It's calling for help," Rachel said, barely believing her own words. Luis laughed, but the laughter died in mid-sentence. "Calling for help? Don't joke. This is a wild bear, not a domestic dog." But there was a hint of doubt in his eyes, too. The bear struggled to its feet, staggered a few steps toward the woods, and then stopped and turned to look at them again. Its eyes met Jack's. A brief moment, but enough for him to understand. It was asking them to follow. What would you do if you stood there when all reason, rules, and survival instincts told you to keep your distance, but your heart whispered otherwise? Jack sighed, feeling as if he were stepping out of the safe cocoon of reason. He muttered, "We are not here to be soldiers. Sometimes, some missions do not require orders." And he began to follow the bear. Will you go with him? Or will you turn away, leaving behind a story that could change your life? The atmosphere inside the Fort Glacier command room was suffocatingly heavy. The cold fluorescent lights reflected off maps covered in military symbols, but none of them showed the path they were about to take. Sergeant Jack Donovan stood tall, his hand clutching the gun at his side, his eyes still fixed on the window where the shadowy outline of a huge grizzly lurked in the dim headlights. It didn't leave. It waited. "We need to report this to higher-ups," Luis said, his voice laced with concern and confusion. "This is a security incident. That bear could be dangerous." Jack didn't answer right away. He stared at the radio, where a push of a button would send everything down a chain of command, procedures, and cold decisions from people who weren't there. But could those rules understand the pleading eyes of a bear? Rachel quietly closed the first aid kit, her eyes unable to hide her confusion, but also a hint of faith. "If the higher-ups get the report," Jack said slowly, "they'll send out a hunting party, or at least a fully armed rapid response team. They'll consider this bear a threat that needs to be eliminated, nothing more, nothing less." Luis raised an eyebrow. "So what do you want to do? Follow it, based on intuition?" Jack turned back, his eyes sharp but no less determined. "It's not intuition. It's something bigger than that. Have you ever been faced with a choice where all reason tells you to give up, but deep in your heart, a little voice whispers, 'Don't turn away'?" That was Jack's moment, a moment that would define the rest of his life. They decided to set out. No backup, no detailed plan, just 3 soldiers, Jack, Luis, and Rachel, and a bold decision. They brought basic medical supplies, flashlights, ropes, and a few guns for protection. But most importantly, they brought something no weapon could replace: faith in the unknown. The bear didn't run away as they approached. It waited, its wide eyes tired but persistent. As Jack stepped closer, the bear glanced at him briefly, then turned and started moving, not fast, but enough to keep them on their toes. Luis sighed, following close behind Jack. "What the hell are we doing? Following a bear? You know what that sounds like." Jack chuckled, not turning around. "Sounds like a story no one would believe unless they lived it." They walked deeper into the cold wilderness of the Yukon, where the lights of the command post faded behind them, giving way to dense darkness and the howling wind. Each step felt like a plunge into another world, where humans were no longer rulers, but mere travelers in the vastness of nature. The bear led the way, stopping occasionally to turn its head to check if they were still following. It was not a normal wild instinct. It was a gentle but urgent reminder. "Hurry, time is running out." Have you ever felt like you were not just going somewhere, but getting closer to a truth larger than yourself? Rachel paused for a moment, her breath misting in the weak flashlight. It knows we're helping it, she whispered. Or maybe we're helping ourselves, Jack replied. After nearly an hour of walking through the snow-covered trails, they noticed something unusual. Small blood stains on the white snow, leading deeper into the dense forest. The bear picked up speed, its huge feet leaving heavy footprints in the snow. Jack felt his heart beat faster, not from fear, but from anticipation of something unclear, but extremely important. They crossed a thin ice bridge over a frozen stream, where the sound of the water flowing under the ice echoed coldly, like a whisper from the abyss. The bear stopped abruptly, standing before a large crack in the ground, groaning in pain. Luis shone his flashlight down. What they saw made all three of them hold their breath. A tiny bear cub, its fur caked with mud and blood, was stuck in the narrow crack. Its eyes were wide, panicked, and exhausted. Not far away was another cub, motionless, seemingly dead. The mother bear could do nothing. She could only stand there, waiting for help from the creatures she should never have trusted, humans. What would you do in that situation? When the line between predator and rescuer was completely blurred, Jack took a deep breath, his eyes meeting the mother bear's. No words were needed. Only one truth echoed in his mind. We're not here to do what's safe. We're here to do what's right. And he took action. The mother bear's faint moans echoed through the silence, fading into the whistling wind, like cold whispers from the frozen Yukon wilderness. Standing before the large crack in the ground, Jack Donovan felt a chill run down his spine, not just from the bitter cold, but also from a sense of unease that crept into his heart. The flashlight beam shone down into the deep hole. The weak rays touched two small bear cubs trapped between the sharp ice and rocks. One of them trembled weakly, trying to move its small legs. The other lay motionless, its fur covered in mud and ice, its body curled up as if holding on to its last bit of warmth. Not a sound came from the three soldiers, only heavy breathing and the wind howling through the dry trees. Have you ever been faced with a scene that wiped all thought from your mind, leaving only a strong urge to act, even though your rational mind was screaming at you to stop? That was the moment. We have to save them. It was Jack who broke the silence. His voice was not loud, but it rang out clearly, like an unquestionable command. Luis blinked, then let out a dry laugh. Easy for you to say. This hole is at least 20 feet deep, covered in ice, and you see that rock wall? It's cracked like it could collapse at the slightest touch. Jack didn't reply. He just bent down to examine the old rescue kit they had brought with them. A few ropes, grappling hooks, and flashlights. None of it was designed for a rescue of this kind. Rachel, even as a military doctor, couldn't hide her confusion. But her eyes soon became determined. I can give them first aid if we get them up. But first, who's going down there? The question hung in the air. Jack tied the rope around himself. I'm going down. Luis grabbed Jack's hand, holding it tight. Are you crazy? If that wall collapses, you'll be buried alive under it. Jack just nodded. I know, but I can't stand by and watch. Have you ever felt like one small action could define you? That if you didn't do it, you'd live with regret forever? That wasn't bravery. That was a necessity. The rescue began. Luis and Rachel held on to the rope as Jack slowly lowered himself into the crevice. The cold air hit him in the face, his breath turning into white mist. He struggled to keep his balance, but the slippery ice and jagged rocks made every step a struggle for survival. The rope screeched as it scraped against the sharp edge of the rock. Jack clenched his jaw, refusing to be distracted. When he reached the two cubs, his heart sank. The bear lay motionless, barely breathing. He quickly checked for a pulse. It was barely perceptible. The other bear whimpered weakly, its eyes wide, alight with panic and hope. But then, a deafening sound tore through the air, the sound of the rock cracking. "Jack, the rock is collapsing," Louise shouted from above. A large chunk of ice fell, nearly hitting Jack. He lost his balance, swinging violently on the rope. Debris rained down, covering the two cubs. There was no time to think. Jack rushed to shield the two bears, using his own body as a shield. The painful impact stunned him, but he did not stop. On the shore, Louise saw the rope begin to fall apart, strands of it brittle and prone to breaking as the frost made it brittle. Without hesitation, he wrapped the rope around his waist, shouting to Rachel, "Hold on tight, I'll help." Louise slid down faster than Jack had. He almost jumped into the crevice, oblivious to the danger. When he reached the ground, he saw Jack struggling against the rocks, his face contorted in pain, but his eyes still shining with unyielding determination. "Help me," Jack gasped, pointing at the motionless bear. Louise picked up the tiny cub. Though his body was shaking from the cold and strain, the bear was as light as air, a bad sign since it was so exhausted. Rachel dropped a first aid kit from above. As Jack and Louise brought the bear to shore, Rachel sprang into action. Have you ever seen a military doctor perform CPR? On a bear cub? Rachel didn't hesitate. She pressed gently on the bear's tiny chest, blowing warm breaths into its tiny, icy muzzle. Louise whispered a prayer, while Jack just stood there, clenching his fists until his knuckles turned white. 1 beat, 2 beats, 3 beats, nothing. But then, a faint whimper. The bear cub opened its eyes. All 3 of them burst into tears. Not tears of weakness, but the tears of people who had just witnessed a miracle, one they would carry with them for the rest of their lives. The mother bear approached, gently touching her nose to the cub. There was no fear. There was no hostility. There was only an invisible bond between man and nature, beyond all instincts and fears. Have you ever wondered what we live for? The mother bear approached, gently touching her nose to the cub. There was no fear. There was no hostility. There was only an invisible bond between man and nature, beyond all instincts and fears. Have you ever wondered what we live for? Not to seek security or accumulate wealth, but to experience moments like this, where you realize that a small act can save a life, and that the human heart is big enough to contain the lives of the smallest creatures. That is how legends are born, not from glorious feats, but from quiet courage and love that transcends all boundaries. 3 days after the dramatic rescue, Fort Glacier was no longer the cold, hard place it had been. Not because of the weather. The snow was still white outside, the wind still howled through the towering antennas, but because something inside, in the hearts of the soldiers here, had quietly changed forever. The 2 bear cubs had made a miraculous recovery. They were no longer the frail creatures huddled in despair. Now, though they still trembled as they walked across the cold wooden floor, their tiny eyes shone with a new light: life, faith, and unspoken courage. The mother bear stayed near the camp for 3 days, never leaving once. She did not destroy, did not roar savagely as her wild instincts had always done. Instead, It waited, a patient, silent wait, as if it knew that these strangers were doing everything they could to save its cub. Have you ever thought that trust doesn't have to be built on words or promises? Sometimes, trust is simply staying, waiting, believing that something good will happen, even if there are no guarantees. The day of parting came. Jack, Louise, and Rachel opened the door to the barracks. Without calling, the mother bear stood there, her big round eyes shining with excitement and something like hope. There were no fences, no guns, no fear. Just man and nature, standing before each other, naked and real. Jack walked slowly forward, his two cubs walking beside him, their steps small but proud. The mother bear approached, no roar, no bared fangs. It just stood there, facing the man who had not turned away when it needed it most. A long moment of silence. No one dared to breathe. Then, the mother bear took a step forward. It gently touched Jack's hand with its head, a gesture both rough and tender. No thanks, no words, but the world seemed to stop. Have you ever felt a gratitude so deep that it didn't need to be expressed in words? A gratitude so pure, so profound that a glance, a light touch, was enough to be etched forever in memory. Jack felt it that day, and he knew that no military feat could compare to this moment. The story spread throughout the base. People told of the soldier and the bear as a legend in the cold, icy land. But to Jack, it was not a story to be told for fun. It was the most profound lesson he ever learned. Sometimes courage lies not in fighting the enemy, but in believing what others consider foolishness. Years later, after Jack had left the army, he was back in the Yukon, standing on the top of a snow-covered hill. In the distance, he saw a family of bears, a mother bear and two adult cubs. They didn't come closer. They didn't need to. Just a glance from afar. But Jack knew. That was them. The family of bears he had saved from the brink of despair. And in that moment, he smiled, without words, without confirmation. Because sometimes, true faith doesn't need words, just an action from the heart. What about you? Have you ever done something just because it was right, without reason, without recognition? Because sometimes, it's those silent actions that are the greatest things in your life. Sometimes in life, we wait for the biggest miracles, but we forget that the real miracles come from the smallest actions. A grateful look, a hand extended at the right time, or simply a decision to dare to believe in the seemingly impossible. The story of Sergeant Jack Donovan and his family of grizzly bears is not just a journey to rescue small creatures. It is a journey to awaken faith in each person. Faith in the invisible connection between humans and nature, between courage and compassion. If this story touches your heart, click like to spread that positive energy. Share it with your loved ones because, who knows, someone out there might need a reminder that kindness is never meaningless. On a scale of 0 to 10, how would you rate this story? Feel free to leave your thoughts in the comments. We're always listening. And if you love inspiring stories like this, don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss out on more heart-touching journeys. In the next video, you'll find an even more surprising story, how a tiny life changed a soldier's life forever. Are you curious? See you there.